How do I define mental health? I would define it as feeling comfortable.
Someone who is mentally healthy is someone who's like stable and confident in themselves.
Having the capacity to feel good about yourself, to go through the day, on a basic level, being able to do what you set out to do.
The ability for, I guess, a person to understand, like what's going on around them.
I would say mental health is the stability that, the stability, like the stability of your mind, but it's like your ability to socially interact properly or however you interact with others.
So health is the absence of illness. I think that's the way a lot of people describe illness, describe health. So you could describe mental health as that also.
Mental health is not the absence of mental illness. It is much more than that.
But defining mental health is not an easy thing. I think for a lot of people, they think they're absolutely fine. But if you then ran structured diagnostic instruments on them, they might come up with a diagnosis that adheres to DSM-4 or something like that.
In general, mental health is a state of psychological well-being, that one brings with oneself, that enables a person to function successfully in life.
It's so broadly and multiply defined, right? I mean, if you're a part of one religious tradition, what mental health is looks really different than if you're just talking to a medical doctor. A medical doctor might actually define mental health as being symptom-free, adaptive, and able to survive in the world without too much distress. Whereas if I'm someone that's a part of a Catholic tradition, to be mentally healthy might actually be being able to recognize my belovedness in God's eyes and live in the world, make it more just and true. And I can go on, right? I'd want to keep it as plural and varied as we have definitions and cultures.
Maybe give them advice or ask them to go to a counsellor.
I would tell him to see a psychiatrist.
I would absolutely say to not be afraid to ask for help and to speak about it.
Taking the steps to talk to your family about it at first and then lead to treatment and try to find the actual good doctor and good care that you can actually receive.
To get help. It's an undiagnosed epidemic.
But now if you look at access to mental health care, it's quite abysmal. About 50% of those who have a mental health problem actually receive care. So those are huge disparities. I mean, it's bad to start with, right?
Not to mention the fact, I'll just say it, that as a society we often actually prefer not having to think about the ways in which there's that disparity.
There's no other area of medicine where you have that few people getting treatment.
We've done some pretty significant damage to ourselves.
Hello, it's nice to meet you.
My name is Valerie Eiffel. I am a co-founder of the group called ROAD, which is reaching out about depression, which was founded in 2003. A lot of the women that we served in ROAD were suffering from stress, from trauma, which resides in the body and in the mind. So I look at the mental health situation from the low-income woman's point of view and not being able, again, for those who are not empowered, don't have their own voice.
So I'm a faculty member in counseling psychology at Boston College in the School of Education. That has taken me down many roads. I've done a lot of work on domestic violence, on poverty and innovative mental health practices, and down the road of being part of the development of ROAD, reaching out about depression.
But ROAD, was a peer support. Was one of the things that we did was we tried to empower women. We had a 12-week workshop series that discussed various topics that went from the myths and stereotypes of depression, domestic violence, healthy relationships, healthy eating, social situations, empowerment in terms of again, the systems that you depend on for your sustenance.
As these women described it, they felt that it was very hard to change their external situations when they were also struggling with depression. So the idea was to address both simultaneously.
There's just so many negative connotations and unhealthful opinions about people who are depressed, that they don't want to get better, or that they don't try hard enough, or like I said, they just don't snap out of it.
They have been told over and over again that they're stupid and lazy, and that they should just get out of bed.
I'm a law school graduate who ended up having a devastating life event in my life, and I ended up leaving Massachusetts, going to Alabama, having a wonderful daughter, had to leave because of domestic violence, came back home, couldn't get a job, couldn't find daycare, and all of a sudden I was a poor person. I didn't have savings, I didn't have a support network. I was so depressed at one point that I literally would not open my mail. I did not want to know what was in it.
I mean, the level of domestic violence among low-income women is extraordinarily high. So it's not surprising that the rates, especially of depression, are so high in that group.
It's always been a class issue.
I'm Julia Witkovich-Devoy.
My name is Debbie Allen.
I'm a member of faculty in the Counseling, Developmental, and Educational Psychology Department at the Boston College Lynch School of Education.
And I'm the Director of Child, Adolescent, and Family Health at the Boston Public Health Commission.
It's not just poverty that keeps us stuck. It's mental health difficulties, depressive symptoms in particular, not just depression, serious mental illness of all forms. Partly born from, individual issues and biology, but partly born from the circumstances in which they found themselves.
So let's say you're a 25-year-old black woman, and you wake up in the morning, and the first thing that happens, because you're also poor, which many black women are, not all, but many, is you're worried about a bill collector calling. So even before you get out of bed, you're experiencing a certain amount of stress. Then you go downstairs, is your car going to start? Are you going to make it to work? You work at a job, like 40% of women in America, where if you don't show up, you don't get paid. You don't have sick leave, you don't have any kind of time off. So, you've barely made it out of the house, and already you've experienced a number of forms of stress.
If you're born into a low-income community, you are more vulnerable to traumatic experiences, just because the resources are not there to protect you.
The ones who are most successful in their recovery are the ones who have families, communities, workplaces that are also willing to make changes around the individual and to support those changes.
We are just having our eyes opened every day by one more study that clearly demonstrates the impact of early stress on long-term health on lifetime health outcomes, and even on the outcomes for the next generation.
And I'm talking about, sort of the death of a parent, the imprisonment of a parent, alcoholism in the family, along with physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, not necessarily by parents, but by community violence, by a whole range of people. And then as you grow up, when you are low income, you face all kinds of, if you're homeless, you face all kinds of traumatic experiences out on the street or in shelters.
Right now in the city of Boston, we have over 7,200 homeless neighbors that are on radar.
But unfortunately, the level of awareness around that is still not where it should be.
My name is Kathy Kim, and I'm a photographer. And I've been working with the homeless neighbors in the city of Boston for over 16 years.
I'm Dr. Eileen Riley, and I work at Mass Mental Health Center, which is a Department of Mental Health clinic. And for the majority of my work at Mass Mental, I work with the homeless. And I'll give you a short story. A woman was sitting outside of South Station on a bench.
One winter we got a call. It was minus 10 degrees outside with the wind chill factor from his friend that he had just seen him on Tremont Street by the South End, and that he was really worried because he had seen him out there for a long time.
We tried desperately to get her into maybe one of the DMH shelters, or at least some shelter. It was getting colder out.
And in those kinds of conditions, if you're outside more than an hour, it starts to impact you physically. And he wasn't doing very well. There were parts of his body that had icicles hanging down from his face. And we were trying to convince him to go into the shelter program.
But she wouldn't budge. And it actually turned out that she thought that Michael Jackson was coming to pick her up and bringing her to a mansion, his mansion in California where she could live.
That's when we were able to call the Department of Mental Health's homeless outreach team to get a Section 35 to bring him in against his will.
We called an ambulance and she went to the hospital. It's always really difficult because I don't like to coerce people into treatment.
If he had not come in within 5 minutes of the time that he was brought in, his internal organs would have failed and he would have passed.
It's thought that about 30% of homeless people have a serious mental illness. The major illnesses that people have are schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression. One of the mottos that we stand by doing this kind of work is meet people where they're at. And what we mean by that is to accept people's present state and not judge it. Just try to understand people's circumstances. Because I think, especially as doctors, we want to fix people. That's what we're trained to do. Then there's sort of a subculture of understanding what homelessness is all about.
It's something that's not really talked about because a lot of people can't see it.
I would have to say the worst injustices in mental health treatment, and I would expand that to include addiction treatment as well, is issues around social class and access.
A lot of inner city clinics and hospitals do feel overwhelmed and they tell the psychiatrist to spend 10 or 15 minutes with people.
Two people with the same mental challenge, the same mental illness, or two people with a similar addiction challenge will receive very different treatment outcomes depending on their social class. And I think that that's just an enormous travesty.
My name's David Goodman. I'm a clinical psychologist and interim associate dean of academic affairs and student services here at the Woods College of Advancing Studies, and a active clinician. In my research, I've understood that to be what I describe as the McDonaldization of psychotherapy. It's actually very, very hard for someone with few resources to receive longer-term, insight-oriented depth of care.
It's like a puppy mill. It's just, you have a bunch of clients, whether they're in Chelsea or whether in South Boston or whether in Lawrence or whether in Lowell, and they get seen by the same practitioner, and everybody can tell you the same horror story about the same therapist, and that's what was happening at Road. People say, well, I see her. Oh, I see her too, and we would exchange stories and find out that all these poor people were seeing these same 3 or 4 therapists.
We have turned otherwise very important systems of responding to human need into conveyor belts, where, much like at McDonald's, there's this premium put on things being efficient and things being repeatable and calculable and all that type of stuff. It's a triage, quick and dirty and nutritionless approach to understanding the human psyche.
Individuals from lower and working class environments are more likely to receive medication and kind of set on their way, whereas mental health clients who are from middle class or upper class backgrounds are more likely to receive combinations of long-term therapy and other modes of treatment and maybe medication as well, but there's just a more a multi-level treatment that is offered.
service providers change rapidly. They don't necessarily stay. They're interns, they're students, or they may be seasoned professionals who only do it pro bono and don't stick with a client long enough to sustain a relationship that you have to keep going over and over again. So a lot of women, when they have to re-enter and retell their story, they're re-traumatized again because they have to tell their story for the 6th time to another person who may not be listening, who may not really care at any given moment in time, and it's just another 15 minutes on the clock. Move on, thank you very much.
I mean, I don't know how to describe it as anything other than a therapy desert. Without money, without insurance plans that recognize this complexity that we're speaking of, there's not a lot of option. That's hence why it's a desert. It's scarce and sparse.
Our goal here is to move from isolation to connection, and connection in turn can, so relationships with other people and working together as a group can in turn lead to longer term outcomes like moving out of poverty or moving out of depression.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times in a hospital I have to actually come up with a diagnosis within the first session. The intake session is the time where I have to ask the questions that will allow me to figure out the category where I can place the person so I could code the session so that it can get reimbursed by the hospital or the clinic. If it's going to be covered by insurance, it has to have an immediate diagnosis. Private practice, person self-paying, I will take at least 10 sessions.
I've had the same therapist for 10 years. I have a working relationship. I trust this person. These people, they did not garner the trust that was necessary to sustain a healthy working relationship between patient and therapist.
There's a lot of evidence to suggest that when professionals believe their client or perceive their client to be of a middle or upper class, they have, more extended and sensitive treatment protocols. They're longer term. They're generally the better models. And when they believe that they perceive the client to be of a lower SES, the expectations are very different, and the treatments that are offered are frequently of a different quality level.
And other systems that are aiming to help low-income women see each problem as a separate, fragmented, single point that needs to be intervened in. And so what you end up with is no attention to the whole person and her experience of her life.
We've done some pretty significant damage to ourselves. And so my hope is not to see religion and philosophy, make their comeback and become dominant. It's more to have them be an equal level of conversation with the things we're learning about human persons.
In Massachusetts, they have access to Mass Health, which means that theoretically, they can get mental health intervention if they can wait it out on a huge long waiting list to finally get their turn for someone who will take their health insurance, if they can come to an appointment at a specified time that may not work with some of the low-wage jobs that they have where there's no flexibility, if they can get to appointments that are not easily accessible by public transportation, if they can find babysitting for their kids that's free, so the obstacles to their accessing the mental health interventions, even when those interventions are free, are formidable. And that's before we get to stigma and cultural barriers.
My name is Kim Ashby. I'm a doctoral researcher for the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture, which we shorten to the ISPRC. The ISPRC really takes an approach at mental health that thinks about the way in which human beings are really grounded in culture and in identity. Boston is a very racially segregated city. You can even tell by the train lines where different people live and what communities hold different identities. And I think that really influences the way in which race relations happen in Boston and the way in which people receive treatment.
My name is Benjamin Cook. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and a senior scientist here at the Center for Multicultural Mental Health Research at Cambridge Health Alliance. Maybe I'll start with the U.S. to give some perspective. In general, Asians, Latinos, and African Americans have rates of mental illness that are very similar to whites, and sometimes lower. Where there's a difference is in persistence and severity. So there are a couple of studies that show that for African Americans, depression is more severe in the African American community than in the white community. The persistence, there's another study that shows that of those who have ever had a mental health disorder, they're more likely to have a last year disorder. So that's a measure of the persistence of it, that if you've ever had it, then you're more likely, if you're a racial and ethnic minority, to have had it in the last year.
Race and culture is related to mental health in that our own understandings of ourselves are very related to the ways in which we can function in the world. Also, experiences with discrimination, with systemic oppression, all of those types of things related to identity are also very linked to mental health.
I'm Margarita Alegría. I'm a professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and I'm director of the Center for Multicultural Mental Health Research at the Cambridge Health Alliance. We really haven't trained people to do a good job with ethnic racial minorities, actually with any minorities.
Sometimes people of color don't always receive the kind of treatment that they would like. Clinicians may not know the different cultural values or norms that are common in the background of the person that they're working with.
What I've really learned is providers interact very differently depending who's in front of them. And I think they particularly interact sometimes not as, I would say, not in the same way as with people of color. I think there are attributional, what we call attributional errors, which is people make attributions very quickly on who's that person in front of you. In the same way, by the way, that patients make attributions of the provider very quickly.
And I think that's kind of a twofold type of dynamic that's going on, because often clinicians don't always feel very confident about working with clients of color, particularly if they are white clinicians.
I think when providers feel their competence is threatened because they don't understand the person, I think it creates even a bigger challenge for them to give good treatment.
There are large gaps in insurance coverage for African Americans and Latinos compared to whites. Now in Massachusetts, the rates of uninsurance have actually gotten much better for many of the residents of Massachusetts, but not for Latinos. So this could be one of the explanations for why African Americans are actually doing better in Massachusetts, whereas Latinos are still lagging behind.
We have a shortage of providers. There's no question.
There are some studies that show in highly segregated communities, in African American communities, Latino communities, Asian communities, the availability of providers is very small, so that the density of providers in those neighborhoods is smaller than areas of in neighborhoods where it's less segregated, where there's more of a mix of race and ethnicities, or white neighborhoods.
We do what's called the area resource file that shows how many providers are per area, and you can see that the areas, especially the areas that are poor and where people of color live, have a much lower rate of providers, especially mental health providers. And when you add to that providers that take Medicaid or Mass Health, the numbers are, you can count them with your hands.
I think, we've tried to do things like expand the provider pool that are culturally appropriate, that speak two different languages, that were raised in the same neighborhoods as racial and ethnic minorities, and the folks that are needing care but not getting care. And that hasn't worked very well.
There's definitely some resources out there, but I think we are a city that is so diverse, it's really very important that we prioritize the mental health treatment of people of color in this city.
My name is Maria Restrepo Toro, and I'm a Senior Training Associate at the Center for Psych Rehab. I've been at Boston University for 22 years. I'm originally from Colombia. It is so challenging for immigrants, and being, an immigrant myself was really hard to acculturate. There's a lot of shame that comes attached, not only for the person's perspective, but from the family perspective.
There's a lot of stigma related to mental health in some communities of color. So if people are only talking and relating to people who look like them racially, they might not be as likely to go seek out mental health treatment because the other people in their community don't necessarily know much about it either.
There's a lot of ways to think about stigma and mental health care. I think the way it's usually thought of is I don't want to go see a mental health provider because I'm not crazy. I don't want other people to think I'm crazy. And I think there's a lot of that, and certainly in a lot of Asian communities, my mother's Vietnamese, a lot of the problems with getting Asians into mental health care is that I think there is a stigma.
No, I'm not crazy.
So I grew up in a household where I was told repeatedly that mental health was something that was not something that we thought of. It's not something that Black people thought of. It was something that belonged in the white world that was quite distant from me.
We hear it in the Latino populations, we hear it in the Haitian populations, we've heard it in the Portuguese populations.
I really want students to know that receiving mental health treatment is not a white thing. It's not an upper middle class thing. It's something that everybody can benefit from.
On the demand side, I think you do have stigma, but you want to be careful about stigma. I think stigma is also driven by what's happened in the community, so previous experiences with mental health care.
There's a great history of clinicians, of doctors, of people in power not necessarily using that power in a just way. So experiments like the Tuskegee experiment, in which Black men were injected with syphilis and not actually given a cure when it was found.
If you have a bad experience in the mental health care system, so then what do? They will likely go back to their family and say, this didn't work. I don't know why people go to see therapists, right? And then they'll go to their community or their friends.
That has really created a sense of fear and distrust amongst a lot of people of color.
So then stigma is more about preferences that people have that are driven by past experiences.
Here in the United States, there's a huge movement called the peer movement, and that means people are coming out and telling more of their life stories, and that's definitely starting to shift because there's a lot of evidence that first contact and hearing somebody else's recovery story is a very powerful way of combating stigma.
What needs to be done is for mental health treatment to seem a little bit more attractive to those communities, which means that we might have to maybe deconstruct the white majoritarian narrative that is often used within mental health treatment and really consider the values that these communities have.
So I'm John Travers. I'm the Director of School Counseling at Brighton High School. I've been the director here for 8 years now. In a school like Brighton, we have 950 students. Half of our students are English language learners, so they're from all over the globe, Central America, South America, Haiti, Cape Verde, and Africa. But each of those cultures has kind of its own take on mental health.
I think considering immigrant populations is very important for Boston specifically because we have so many immigrant populations within Boston.
I'm Barry Schneider, and I'm new to Boston. I was a professor of child clinical psychology at the University of Ottawa. There are many mental health challenges with the experience of immigration. Often, people have high expectations of their lives after they immigrate. They expect, in some cases, problems to go away, and sometimes they do. But very often, immigrants have to face the challenge of being disappointed. Okay. Other problems have to be with being unfamiliar with the language, with the social customs, with the conventions. Sometimes there are problems because people have lost social contacts, family contact with their friends.
Acculturation is a really big piece when we consider the mental health of people who are immigrating to the United States. So, for example, trying to acculturate to our, predominantly white culture here that often has very individualistic values is something that can be very difficult.
It's usually more acceptable in many immigrant communities to say you have a stomach ache, a headache, you're getting tired, coming in for a physical complaint, because you're simply ashamed to say that you're coming in for any type of psychological issue.
We had a young gal who was from Africa, very strong student. Senior year, as she got involved into the college process, she admitted to her guidance counselor that she had done some cries for help, kind of attempted suicide, but she wound up going with a guidance counselor from the emergency room to the psych ward to make sure that she was not at risk to herself or to others. When the father came, he said that there is no such thing as mental health, that the American culture has made that up, that his daughter was perfectly fine back in Africa.
Most immigrant groups are more oriented towards extended family than the traditional Anglo-European majority culture of the United States. So relationship issues, family relationship issues are extremely important.
One of the delicate balances is, as our students come from all over the world, is respecting their native culture, where they come from, and still having them understand that what their culture believes can still be in line with mental health. So now it becomes a team approach of the family helping the child, the school's clinician helping the child, and the child realizing it's okay to need help. It's okay that I'm getting services, that there's a lot of students in our school getting services. What can we do as a team to help your son or daughter feel better about themselves and be successful? So let's go beyond our culture, how we look at mental health, but let's just focus on the child and say, what can we all do to help he or she find success, feel good about themselves, and have a successful high school experience.
It's very important, I think, for the mental health community to adjust to the conditions under which immigrants live and occasionally seek help.
I think that it really starts with training. I think that when it comes to many mental health professionals, they haven't necessarily received the training to work with people of color or are even told the importance of cultural competence, especially if they were trained decades ago. That might not have been something that was emphasized in their program.
So I don't see it so much as a racism, to be honest. I see it more coming from people being clueless. So to me, one of the things that has happened over time is seeing that people are motivated to be good clinicians, but once they start confronting that they don't understand the person, that they don't really understand how to provide good care, it's like you're starting from a lower level of competence, and that makes you feel very uncomfortable. And as a result, I think it shows up in how you treat that person.
Cultural competence has a lot of different components. At one point in time, it was really taught in terms of knowing how to work with different minority racial populations. But I think ideally cultural competence would be much greater than that. It's really an understanding of power, privilege, and the ways in which our identities influence how we can function in the world.
When we go around educating communities and people and making interventions culturally competent, tailored specifically to them, we also are bringing the message of hope.
I believe in mental health. You don't hit a lot of home runs, but you hit a lot of singles, a lot of doubles.
One thing that really gives me hope is that the field of psychology is becoming much more diverse.
You know, I think I think, you know, you're our hope. I mean, I think in many ways, I think people are less tolerant of injustice. And I think this one is a big one. And it's a big one that has implications for everything.
I think that it's important for mental health professionals to connect even better, and Boston is doing a very good job with this.
Boston is great in that it has some community mental health centers and other resources that really have made efforts to reach out to different diverse community members.
It's easy access housing, and I think that's been a really hopeful thing for me to see.
We'll see students that are going to pass their classes and be promoted to the next year because they found academic success through someone helping them navigate social, emotional, and behavioral concerns they had.
An emphasis on social justice as a core facet of being a mental health professional has also really improved the field. Now it's not only expected that you know the theory and psychology and know the methodology behind providing mental health treatment, but also really having an understanding of what justice means and what it means to be a social justice agent has really kind of transformed the field.
And what it's saying to me is other people are really concerned, and other people actually don't want to see this ongoing trend.
Well, we do have a lot of great resources in the city of Boston.
I think it's becoming a higher priority for more people. So I am more hopeful than before.
What gives me hope about the future of mental health care? People like me who don't give up. People like my daughter who's going to continue the legacy. People like you who've come all the way out to my house from BC. You get other things to do that probably, I won't say, could be as important, but you've taken the time to come to my house and listen to my story and listen and talk about Roe. People like Lisa Goodman. Again, I think it's this is the ripple in the pond that I'm talking about. This gives me hope.